Anything else you guys want me to add to your little bios there for the purposes here?
Extraordinarily good looking. No.
Okay. Should I say the extremely
witty conversationalist?
Okay, so you're joking.
No,
I'm going to do it.
The bio doesn't. Nobody likes an intro where you read a CV. So
I know. That's why I'm trying to make them fun. The extraordinarily good-looking Judkin Browning, and then Timothy. What did you say? Extreme conversation. What did you say?
A witty conversationalist.
Witty conversationalist. Okay. List. Yeah. Okay.
Said by the man who hasn't had to engage in conversation with himself.
Ouch.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, patrons, and welcome to this special episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we are talking to two authors who have written a book called An Environmental History of the Civil War. It is a fascinating book. For those of you who are interested in all of the other stuff surrounding the armies, this is the book for you, I think. And also its impact on the environment, how they lived with the environment, how they changed the environment. There's just so many different things that you can learn in this book. I highly recommend that you get it. And we're very lucky to have both of the authors on today. Who are the authors? Well, first of all, we have the extraordinarily good-looking Judkin Browning. He's a professor of military history at Appalachian State University. Did I say it right? Appalachian or...
That's it.
Okay. Appalachian State University, and the author of Shifting Loyalties, the Union Occupation of Eastern North Carolina. And we also have a witty conversationalist named Timothy Silver, and he is a professor of environmental history at Appalachian State University and the author of Mount Mitchell and the Black Mountains, an environmental history of the highest peaks in Eastern America. And together they wrote an environmental history of the Civil War, and here they are with us on Addressing Gettysburg today. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for accepting our invitation. So, let's get into how'd you guys come about writing this book together? Whose idea was it? How'd you do it? All that jazz. Why'd you do it?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and claim that it was my idea to do the book, and Judkin won't argue with me too much. I had thought for a long time about doing an environmental history of the Civil War because environmental historians believe that it's impossible really to understand any event in human history without looking at the natural world in which that event took place. Mm-hmm. And so I'd often thought the Civil War was ripe for that kind of a study. Unfortunately, maybe fortunately for Civil War historians, but I discovered that it was the most written about event in American history, with about 50 to 60,000 books already out there. And in this lifetime, there was no way I was going to master that literature. I could do the environmental stuff, but not the Civil War stuff.
Right.
So one day I was actually reading a journal article about chestnut blight, believe it or not, and I noticed that the biologist who had written the article had called in a geneticist to help him, and suddenly it was like something hit me upside the head, and I thought, why don't I just call in a military historian who understands the Civil War? And so, I called Judkin and cajoled for a while, and he agreed to come on board.
And that makes sense. You get someone who can speak to it. So real quick, explain to our listeners what exactly the field of environmental history is before we move on to when Judkin comes in. I want to get that background in there.
Yeah, well, as I said, the sort of fundamental premise of environmental history is that to understand any human action, you have to understand the physical environment in which that human action took place. In other words, for example, you couldn't really write about something happening today without writing about, COVID-19 and everything that's going on with that. And so what we try to do is recreate the past environment in which people operated and functioned on a day-to-day basis. And a simpler way of explaining it that I always tell students is it's history with the plants and animals left in.
Okay.
Not left out as they so often are.
Right. But it makes total sense. We are limited by our environment, so that has a huge impact on how history unfolds. So that's it's an interesting topic. I've never heard of it until I've discovered this book, and then I'm glad you cleared that up for me. So now Judkin gets involved in the book. Judkin, were you excited when he asked you to do this, or were you like, this is a daunting task, or what was your reaction?
So when we first came up with the idea or first started talking about it, it was back in the summer of 2011. We were actually in a long car ride to Washington, D.C. to watch some baseball, actually. And I was working on a book on the 7 Days battles. Tim was working on an article, and we started talking about, he was looking at an environmental angle, and I was doing a more traditional military history. And so it was just that conversation, I think, that planted the seed. And so when Tim came to me about a year later and said, hey, I want to do this book, and you want to do it with me? I was a bit hesitant because I was working on other projects at the time, but he was like, this will be back burner. Don't worry, we'll just work on this a little bit at a time over the next few years. And so I was like, sure, let's do it. And then we had the misfortune or fortune. Actually, we were very fortunate. We got a pretty sizable grant from the American Council of Learned Societies to work on this book. And so suddenly it went from being back burner to front burner. And so, but yeah, I mean, I was excited to work on it, especially once I started digging into it and realized that, as a military historian, there's environmental aspects that all military historians pay at least some lip service to, such as weather or the health of soldiers and things like that.
Yeah.
But when we really started researching in this, and I started recognizing all the different questions that you could ask of these well understood military events, it really became an exciting project for me. And so it was an enjoyable ride, mostly throughout the book.
How do you find? I guess you have to use a lot of firsthand accounts to get those details about environment and food and animals and things like that, right? I mean, like I said before, I have always been interested in that stuff when I hear about it, but when I read a general history of whether it's a battle or campaign or a regiment or whatever, I mean, I notice in the regimental histories you might find a little bit more detail like that, or if it's someone's memoirs, of course. Mm-hmm. But when you're finding those general histories, like they might mention them here and there where it's like a colorful anecdote or something, but they really don't get into it, at least as far as I've found so far. So where do you go to find all that information?
Well, so it's twofold. One is, you're right, that most of the anecdotes and stuff that sort of drove our research came from the very well-known primary sources that most Civil War scholars and Civil War buffs are aware of. The 128-volume official records of the war, obviously, published soldier diaries and letters, some memoirs, unpublished soldier diary and letters. And, soldiers are very good about writing about mundane things, the weather, sort of unusual events like, animals and gruesome deaths and bad water, things like that. And so once you sort of see what the soldiers are saying, then an environmentalist comes in and basically starts rooting into the sort of scientific underlying of what's going on here. And Tim and I joked that, to quote Matt Damon in the movie The Martian, that we were going to science the shit out of this. And that's sort of what happens. I mean, it's one thing to hear soldiers write and talk about, well, 90% of our regiment are sick with typhoid fever. And then the question is, well, where does typhoid fever come from? Right. Why is that? And so then I hand it to Tim, and he roots around epidemiology databases and tackles that.
Yeah.
And that's how we blended our different expertises. And
what, like for example, yeah. So there was one thing in there. There's a couple of terms that are jumping out. Right. One is called stem rust for crops, which I had never heard before. And then something was a greasy hook.
Greased heel.
What is
Greased
it?
heel.
Greased heel. Yeah. Yeah. So these are things that are very real. They affect the food. They affect the animals. The animals are very important because they get the armies around. We're talking horses and mules and stuff at this point. So they get their transportation, their labor, very important things for an army. So what is greased heel, by the way, just to...
It's a problem with horses, and it's sort of what it sounds like. It's an inflammation and then an infection of the lower leg of horses, and it can be caused by a variety of bacteria, fungi, several different causes for it. But it usually happens when horses are forced into crowded, unsanitary conditions where they have to stand around in a lot of mud and their own excrement and that kind of thing. And it's completely disabling for horses. And it became a problem in the Civil War when you brought all these horses together and then put them under those conditions. And it could cause horses to come up lame. And then if that happens, you've got no way to move anything. Everything that moved during the Civil War, pretty much, except the soldiers walking, moves by animal power, whether it's artillery, supply wagons, whatever. So it could be incredibly devastating. And the only cure for greased or greasy heel was to just sort of take the horses out of action for a while and let them recover under better, more sanitary conditions. And so, that's a good example of the kind of research we were doing, where you would read something like greasy heel and then, get into the veterinary literature and say, well, wait a minute, is that really a thing? And what causes it? And,
Yeah.
What can we discern from that?
So not only were, we hear about soldiers all coming together and getting all these communicable diseases from, being crowded in these nasty camps and just being around a lot of people and everything, but the same thing happens to the animals. It's not just people.
Yeah. But much worse than greased heel was a disease among horses called glanders or farcy.
Mm. Oh, yeah, that was another one I marked down to ask you about.
It's caused by bacteria, and it's usually fatal if it takes the form of glanders. Sometimes they recover from farcy, but that was far more common because you brought horses together from all over the country, previously isolated, and then it only takes one horse that's infected to set off, an epidemic, or epizootic is what it's called among animals. And there are a lot of good stories that go along with that. After the first Battle of Bull Run, I believe I should let Judkin talk about battles. He's better than that at that to me. After the first Battle of Bull Run, sort of each side accused the other of leaving behind infected horses, kind of an equine weapon of mass destruction.
Right. Yeah, and what did how did glanders affect them? What was it exactly?
It's glanders is a respiratory disease, and it causes congestion in the horse's respiratory system, and they can actually suffocate from it.
Oh, wow!
And it progresses fairly quickly. And if there wasn't really much that could be done. Most of the time, you just had to put the animal down, shoot it, and leave it.
It's amazing. The more, that war is just a horror show everywhere you go, but then learning about the animals and everything that they had to go through, I don't know. We tend to. It seems like humans tend to feel sorry for animals more than other humans, and so you hear about them riding horses to death and then just getting another one and riding it to death, and they're at the mercy of what's required by the service. And you go, God, this is so sad. It's like now it's more of a horror show to me than it already was from hearing about the human toll. So yeah, it's go ahead.
And that's true too. I mean, we mentioned in the book how, there are famous examples of guys who have personal relationships with their horses, why they're very fond of their horses.
Yeah.
Daniel Webster is the horse of George McClellan, of course, Traveler
right.
for Robert E. But that throughout the war, in the eyes of the Army, horses really were just sort of living machines.
Yes.
Like used cars. And, if this one's worn out, let's, get rid of it and get another one, because they had a war to fight, and it really was, sort of a horse holocaust. I mean, the Civil War. I mean, 1 out of every 6 horses in the United States died during those 4 years, and kind of hard to fathom.
About how many horses were there in the United States at the outbreak of the war?
There were about 6 million horses when the war began,
and
about 1.2 million died.
You, in the book, you say, like their civilian counterparts, the animals first had to be pulled from civilian life and made ready for battle. So what did that process entail? What was it like to train a horse to be a soldier?
Well, it wasn't a very smooth operation. To put it in comparison, European observers ridiculed American cavalry all through the war. And part of the reason is because the European armies would take 2-3 years to train a cavalry regiment, train a cavalry soldier. And in the United States, the war breaks out in April of 1861. Some of these guys are joining cavalry regiments, and they've only had a few weeks worth of training. And so you have guys who have almost never ridden a horse before. I mean, if you're talking about city dwellers in the North, and they're suddenly trying to figure out how to ride a horse. And then, of course, the horses themselves haven't been raised and groomed to be cavalry horses. They haven't been raised for speed and strength. I mean, they're mainly draft horses from home. And so it's a hodgepodge all the way through. I mean, everybody's basically making do as best they can. And it leads to a lot of worn out horses, a lot of mismanaged horsemanship, especially in the North early on. To a certain extent, the South being a more rural society, a little bit more familiarity with horses, a little bit more perhaps better treatment of them, at least early on. But there were just so many fewer horses to go around in the South that eventually making do with whatever they could get. And the problem is you couldn't even create a horse farm to sort of raise war horses, because a horse isn't really considered adequate material for military service until it's about 4 years old. It's considered enough then. And so, there was just no time. The war only lasted 4 years. You have no time to start a horse farm.
Right. So reading about the horse situation, especially in the South, it's a wonder that by the end of the war that there was a cavalry, or that horses were used for artillery. At that point, I mean, they had fewer of them. It was harder to get them, yet somehow there were horses by the end of the war. It's weird. Now, you mentioned, or you talk about procurement depots. What were they? Did they have them in the North and the South, or just the North, or how did that all work?
So the North was really much better on procurement. The North. First of all, they had twice as many horses as the South did. The North had about 3.5 million horses. The South had about 1.7 million horses when the war began. And so the U.S. government could go and purchase horses at procurement depots. They basically would contract with farmers to provide or contract with agents, not necessarily farmers. And these agents would go around from farm to farm paying for horses. And they would pay in the neighborhood of $150 a horse, and so that's a pretty good, it's a pretty good deal for some farmers with some excess horses, and they set up procurement depots where they basically would the agents would go around and contract the horses and then bring them to certain urban areas for which they would then be dispersed, probably by rail to wherever the armies were. And so the North actually, especially under the Quartermaster Montgomery Meigs, had a very efficient way of acquiring horses, to the point where the Union armies almost never suffered from a shortage of horses, or if they did, it was for a very limited period of time. Mm-hmm. The South, very different, of course. Basically, how Southern cavalry worked was if you joined the cavalry, you brought your own horse. And as a result, most of the men who served in the cavalry, on average, were wealthier than infantry soldiers because, of course, they had to have the means to have horse and bring it with them. And then, of course, the Confederacy runs into some trouble as the war goes on, because, of course, if you're a cavalry guy and you're expected to provide your own horse, what better way to get a furlough than to sell or damage your horse? And then you have to go home and acquire another horse. And so there's actually some complaints in the Confederate Army about abuse of that system. And so the Confederate government, while it makes some efforts to contract and acquire horses, because there are fewer to go around, it's never anywhere near as efficient as the Northern government is.
Right. So just for the audience's sake, to be clear, if they don't know, in the Confederate Army, if you're in the cavalry and your horse, whether you do it or the enemy does it, your horse is dead or disabled, it's up to you to go and get a new mount.
That was the general expectation.
Yeah, and so that meant that you would have to go home or you would have to go elsewhere to find one, right?
Right. Sometimes you didn't have to go far to procure another horse.
Right.
But if you wanted to go further, then, it's up to the individual soldiers. Now, of course, the Confederate government or the Confederate Army sort of clamps down on that after a while when they suspect abuse going on, and they reroute some guys from cavalry to infantry and that sort of thing. But yeah, early on, it was you provide your own mount sort of situation.
And there's also a problem with shoes, horseshoes. I remember I read an anecdote. I think it was Henry B. McClellan that recorded it, but don't quote me on that. But he said, excuse me, he said that it wouldn't be uncommon to see a man, walking with his mount shoeless, and he's walking the horse, and there's the sawed-off legs of another horse hanging from the saddle that he would just carry with him until he could get to a place to get the right tools to take the shoes off and put them on his horse.
I mean, that sounds like something that very well could have happened. So
yeah. One of the real inventions that helps the North is a standardized horseshoe that's developed shortly before the war breaks out, so that you can actually ship horseshoes that are close enough fit to the battlefield and shoe horses with them. The South never got that. And they were going around, scavenging whatever metal they could after a battle to, melt it down and have blacksmiths make horseshoes. So it was really a technological advantage that the North had. I believe the guy that invented the shoe, his name was Henry Burton, something like that invented the standardized horseshoe. And you could ship, hundreds, thousands of these things to the Northern Army. Something that looked like a nail keg, only it was bigger. And that really proved, beneficial.
So the North would have shoes that are close enough, and then the blacksmith or the farrier, I guess that would be the farrier that would do that. Is that right? Yeah. He would then just make minor adjustments to get it to fit the particular horse, right? Whereas and what you're saying in the South is that they would have to make a whole shoe from scratch.
Yeah, but sometimes I don't think the standardized shoes even needed that much adjustment. They were just,
that
good enough.
Yeah, close enough. Right.
And part of it was that all horseshoes had been made by hand up until just a few years before the war.
Right.
And then, as mentioned, Henry Burton creates this sort of like mass production horseshoe. And suddenly the North has an advantage the South doesn't have.
What was the average life of a horse once it was in military service?
One Confederate source says the average life of an artillery horse was 7.5 months. And so, that's an artillery horse basically most likely dying from overwork and exhaustion.
Yeah.
Because, only like 10% of all animals died from combat during the war. And so if an artillery horse, and that's one of the few sources we have that is very specific about it. So he says the average life expectancy of an artillery horse is 7.5 months. You got to figure a cavalry horse, probably less.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Maybe teamster horses pulling supply wagons, maybe they lasted a little bit longer if well fed. But
with horses, besides shoeing, you've got to feed them. And there's a little book that I have, I don't know if you've seen it, called Gettysburg by the Numbers. It's this tiny little book, and it's just got a bunch of stats and everything like that. And you guys talk about this too, so I'll let you do it. But I first read about just how much goes into feeding a horse for a day, just a day. And then what astounded me the most, and I don't know if this is because I just never really got out of that toilet phase as a child, but what what
I know where
really
this is going.
Yeah, I know where it's going.
yeah, of course, who wouldn't? I mean, what astounds me is how much waste comes out of these animals, and you add that to the human waste. What a stinky mess it must have been being around these armies. You must have been able to smell them for miles. Talk about how did you feed the horses and the mules? How much did you feed them, and then how much did they give back?
Well, I was going to start with the excrement here, which is about 35 pounds we estimate per animal per day of solid waste, and about 6 gallons of urine per animal per day. And just to give you some idea, McClellan during the Peninsula Campaign had something over 40,000 horses. So you can sort of do the math on that one.
No,
I think it's important to remember that as bad as that sounds to us, these were 19th century people who were used to, being around animals and being around, horses. So
they knew how to handle it.
Right. I have a friend here who has horses, lives out of town a little bit, and we were doing a book just to sort of get an idea about this. I went over and sort of hung out at his barn for a while, and there's, it's a constant thing to be, clearing the area of manure and making sure the animals are fed. And so he only had, maybe half a dozen horses total. So.
I mean, one horse is enough. I mean, I have a friend who had horses, and I used to help. And to just take care of one horse and, clear out his stall and do all that stuff, it was daunting. But an army, would they take much care with the excrement and everything like that? I mean, if you've got, I don't know, let's say 10,000 horses with your unit and you're camped around, how would they do that? How would they, so to speak, corral the shit?
Well, I mean, when in camp, of course, they would indeed. When the horses were sort of corralled together, they knew the sort of unsanitary nature of a large amount of excrement, especially near water sources and stuff. They would shovel and move that stuff over into areas that aren't going to be danger to the soldiers. But, on campaign, on march or whatnot, you're not shoveling horse shit. You're just, you're just trudging along in the rain and the mud behind the horses. And as many soldiers say, as one soldier on the peninsula says, we were happy to dip our canteens into the wheel ruts and get some muddy water because they were so thirsty. Really? And of course, all fecal bacteria that's inside those wheel ruts too.
Yeah.
And guys talk about all the time of like drinking water from creeks that have dead horses laying in the creeks just like 10 feet away. But like, hey, when you're thirsty, any water tastes good. And
it's amazing.
So they recognize that I may feel the effects of this later, but I'm willing to risk it because
I'm thirsty now.
I'm thirsty.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it was a nasty business. You were correct. Feeding a horse also was impressive because, a horse eats, 13 pounds of hay and 12 pounds of grain a day. And, 40,000 horses in the Army times 25 pounds of feed a day. If you want to give a horse his full rations, I mean, most of your supply wagons are actually full of hay and stuff for the animals because if you think about it, a cavalry regiment could just eat the land bare of grass in a day or two. And so you can't just like live off the land for the horses alone. So it's one of the things that people don't recognize is, all the supply wagons that follow an army, many of those supply wagons are actually carrying fodder for the horses.
So, yeah. So where are they getting that fodder to put in the supply wagons to bring to the armies in the field and feed the horses?
Well, as with most things, the North was better at that than the South, and mainly because the war's not fought on northern soil, and so they have access to hay, and from the northern states and also from the Midwest, and they get they're very efficient early on at creating these mechanical devices called hay presses, which you can cut hay and then put it in this machine that looks sort of like some sort of a mechanical press that would then push the hay into a bale. Then they would wrap it and ship it out. Now, what we discovered in the South was that for the most part, Southerners fed their horses like they fed men. So, you always hear that the North was much better supplied with food for humans, but also for animals. It's no contest really in the supply.
Part of it too was the nature of the soils. Northern soils were so much better at growing pasture grasses and meadows and things like that. Timothy and alfalfa or whatnot grew much better on northern soils because they had been underneath the glaciers for longer and had more nutrients in their soils. Whereas southern soils had basically many of the nutrients had been leached away over eons, and as a result, while the South is quite an agricultural area, of course, it's a very delicate balance even today, Southern farming. And so the South couldn't maintain the same quality pasture grasses for horses. And so the northern horses are eating better quality food and of it. Yeah. And there's this one example after Gettysburg where Lee's horses are suffering so bad that for a stretch there in like August of 1863, Lee can't move his army. He's always thinking offensively, and he can't move his army because he doesn't have food for the horses because it's a bit of a drought. All the grasses are brown. So there's not much for the horses to eat. And we have an example in the book where it says the horses are only getting about 1 pound of corn a day, and no horse is getting more than 5 pounds of corn a day. And again, this is an animal that needs 25 pounds of hay or grain each day. And for a while in August, that animal's getting 1 pound of food.
And corn isn't good for horses, right? It's
not long term,
right? No. You mentioned soils, and we're going to get to food in a second, and soil comes up in that too. But I wanted to just finish up the animals thing here. After a battle, you're going to have dead horses, dead mules. That's going to cause problems for the armies and the civilians. What were some of those problems? How were they disposed of? Things like that.
Well, to be specific to Gettysburg, the widow Leister, who lives there on Cemetery Ridge after the pounding from the artillery, and Judkin, please correct me if I'm getting anything wrong militarily here.
So far, so good.
So far, so good. She comes back after leaving her farm. She had a 2-room house there, and I think 6 children, something like that. Yeah. And she comes back after leaving, when the armies were closing in on Gettysburg, and there's 17 dead horses lying in her yard. And for her, that's an immediate pressing problem. It's July, the horse flesh begins to decay, and what are you going to do? And you think about just the sheer volume of decomposing flesh there. And even now, there are only about 3 ways to get rid of a dead horse. You can bury it, which was mostly impractical. You can burn it, which is what generally happened, and a lot of that was done in Gettysburg. Or you can just leave it, which was far more common throughout the war. And what tends to happen, too, never underestimate American capitalism in all this. Companies are formed that go to the battlefield and scavenge for horse flesh. And they recover it to the extent that they can, and then turn it into process things like glue. The bones could then be ground into fertilizer, which was done at Gettysburg. And, so there's a whole kind of industry that evolves in getting rid of dead horses. The same is true for dead people on the battlefield. And it's during the Civil War that we see all kinds of interesting developments in caskets. We see the process of embalming kind of begin to develop fully to get Northern soldiers back to their home ground so that they can be buried. And one of the things that we stress in the book is that human bodies, just like dead horses, became commodities. They were harvested off the battlefield, shipped, preserved, and shipped to another locale. And there's advertising that went along with it. Some places are saying, our bodies never turn black. You can count on this basket not to produce a smell. So there's all kinds of interesting things going on. And I had one more thing about Gettysburg. What happens after that battle, and even during the battle, is that you would normally expect maybe scavengers, things like buzzards and feral dogs and that sort of stuff to show up on the battlefield. But apparently those kinds of things were scared off by the smoke and the noise of the battle. But the animals not scared off are the local hogs who, get onto the battlefield and start scavenging among the remains, and sometimes even went after the living.
Yeah.
There with a wound. So
they were having a smorgasbord, those hogs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they were already used to eating anything humans left behind, pretty much, and so for them, it's an ecological windfall.
Sure.
Look at this buffet they've spread out for us here.
So, there's a story, I think Mrs. Leister was upset because they piled some of the horses that were left on her property around her prized peach tree and set them on fire and ruined the tree. She was very upset about the tree. It was a mess all over the place. I think here burning was the way to go. I'm sure everywhere that was kind of the way to go, but Did the armies travel with other types of animals that would be used for food, like cattle or pigs or something like that, or would they, where would they get beef and stuff like that?
So beef was frequently provided on the hoof. You have stories of the army marching, thousands of head of cattle ahead of them. Again, go back to McClellan's Peninsula campaign. When he starts his retreat during the 7 days, he still has 2,500 head of cattle. And so during the retreat, they're marching at the head of the column, which, of course, adding more excrement on the road for the soldiers coming behind. Thank you very much. But otherwise, the animals would be slaughtered and salted and then barreled up and sent to the army. So you have salt beef and salt pork, of course, which are the staples of armies and South. Typically, they didn't herd hogs with the army. Just easier to slaughter hogs and transport them already preserved, so to speak.
Right.
But it still has. Again, we mentioned earlier, we touched on these diseases that affected animals, and the same was true for the animals that provided the food supply. I mean, you have cattle tick fever and other diseases that affect cattle. And then especially in hogs, in the South particularly, you have devastating epidemics of a disease called hog cholera, which wipes out is an extremely contagious disease and just wipes out large populations of hogs in the South, greatly reducing the amount of salt pork and bacon they can provide to the troops, to which anybody who studied the Civil War for any length of time at all realizes that, the South is always chronically short of protein. They're on quarter rations all the time. And part of it is a number of reasons. Part of it is because, of course, the North has occupied a lot of southern land. Part of it is because before the war, a lot of people aren't aware that the South actually imported a lot of their meat, even pork. They imported it from Cincinnati and other places. That was cut off when the war began. And then the other thing is, in addition to consuming the hogs that are remaining, many of those hogs are coming down with hog cholera and are no longer reproducing other little hogs. And so, food becomes pretty severe.
And the North seemed to be a lot better at packaging foods and preserving foods. Am I right in that? Or, I mean, there's a story at Manassas Junction of, Jackson getting the trains, and there's the list of foods that are available to these Confederates that they're stealing from the Yankees is quite impressive. Go into that a little bit.
And
Canned lobster.
some fine wines and all sorts of things. Yeah.
Go ahead, talk about that a bit.
You have Jackson's soldiers who have not eaten well in months, to be honest, because the Confederate commissary system's breaking down. These guys had been in the Shenandoah Valley, and then they capture Manassas Junction, behind Pope's army in August of 1862, and there are just literally mountains of food there. I mean, the soldiers sort of have stars in their eyes and imagine gorging themselves until they explode, and they nearly do. I mean, they eat as much of it as they possibly can, and then they have to put the rest to the torch because they simply don't have the logistical means to transport this food. And so, of course, this is right before the Second Battle of Bull Run. And yeah, I mean, it's the things that the Union Army has canned is impressive. And the Southern armies the Southern soldiers are always amazed by the variety and the diversity of foodstuffs that are available.
If I were a Confederate and I saw that, I would say we can't win this. Like that would tell me that we can't win. That because here, if you don't, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but let me just give the audience an idea here. In the book, you say this is on page 74. Boxcars and warehouses bursting with gastronomic delights tempted the hungry soldiers, who filled their haversacks with cakes, candy, fish, ham, lemons, oranges, wine, and canned goods of great variety. One soldier noted, quote, "To see a starving man eating lobster salad and drinking Rhine wine, barefoot and in tatters, was curious. The whole thing was indescribable." But it didn't last long, though. They had to destroy it.
Right.
They had to destroy it because they couldn't transport it.
Right. Yeah, they didn't have the wagons and the capacity. They didn't have any railroad cars there with them to move them out. So, but yeah, I think you're right in the sense that if you're a Southern soldier and you see how well the Northerners are eating, you're thinking, man, we probably can't win this. But also, on the other hand, Southerners are thinking, well, the North is feeding us as well because we're capturing Northern supplies. The famous story in the Shenandoah Valley campaign, right, is that Nathaniel Banks was nicknamed Commissary Banks because Jackson's army captured so many of his food supplies. Yeah. They basically said he was feeding the army.
Yeah, but they couldn't rely on that, though.
No. Right. And the other thing is, the North is just, again, a more entrepreneurial, capitalistic society before the war. And so you have more mechanical methods of farming and harvesting, whether it's John Deere and the steel plow, or Cyrus McCormick and the mechanical reaper, which ironically he created in Virginia and then moved his operations to Chicago. And then John and Hiram Pitts of Maine, who created the mechanical thresher, so you can get the food out of the fields quicker. And then, of course, all the different canning process from Isaac Winslow, who introduced metal canning. Forget his last name, who in 1860 figured out Isaac Solomon, who figured out how to sterilize it and make metal canning safer for consumption. And then, of course, Gale Borden, who figured out how to can condensed milk. And so, these are just examples of the way that North can produce food astronomically, exponentially more than the South.
A lot of these names you're saying are names I recognize from companies that still exist.
Sure.
Yeah. That's the Civil War is a fascinating time. It's a lot of of what we have today comes out of the Civil War still, and people don't realize it. So let's get into food more in depth now. So in the Eastern Theater, the Virginia is the main theater of the war, and it is ravaged by the armies. First of all, before the war breaks out, how great of an area is Virginia for planting crops and things like that? What kind of agriculture was found in the war zone before the war?
Tim,
Virginia, of course, is one of the older settled regions on the East Coast, and tobacco farming began there in the colonial period, and so those soils have been used quite extensively by the time the war breaks out in 1861, and a lot of the growing of tobacco has shifted over to wheat and and a lot of it, the tobacco growing has switched over to wheat, corn, that kind of stuff. But you're also dealing with soils there, as Judkin was saying earlier, that are not the greatest to begin with. And farming, wherever it's practiced, and especially if you're in an area where soils have been used for a while, is a dicey business anyway. You have to deal with all kinds of unknowns, weather, pests, almost anything that can disrupt a crop. And so when you have that, which is already a sort of a dicey way of making a living, and then you throw in armies of tens of thousands of soldiers that are foraging for food, it doesn't take very long for the area to be, as the common expression during the war was, eaten out.
Mm-hmm. If you look at pictures of Virginia during the war, it looks like a barren wasteland. It doesn't look like it does today. There's no lush and beautiful grounds. It's just all dirt. No trees, no woods anywhere, just dirt.
Yeah, and places where armies stayed for any length of time were just, I mean, like you said, it was just a sort of an ecological wasteland when they left.
What does that do when it rains?
Plague of locusts.
Yeah, right. Yeah. What does that do to the environment when the grass and everything, the land is just denuded and it's just ground? Like when it rains, what does that do? What kind of a mess does that cause?
Well, the first thing it does is tend to, channel the human and animal waste into the available water sources, which kind of compounds that whole problem.
Okay.
And then you've also got a situation there where the people who live nearby are deprived of kind of the basic necessities of life, not just food, but firewood, healthy drinking water. And almost any place one of these big pitched battles takes place, where it's Antietam or Gettysburg or any of the others, when the armies move on, there's a lot of sickness and starvation among the civilian population. One of the things we really stress in the book is that when these armies move into these areas, it's like an instant city.
Yeah.
But without the infrastructure to maintain that city. No sewer system, no water carriage system to run off waste, no way of providing potable water, and no way of providing food. So, I mean, you just have these sort of pop-up cities, and when that happens, the place is just devastated.
Right. Yeah. I think you said that after Antietam, the population from the armies being there was more than or as much as Chicago? Is that right?
Yeah. While both armies are there, it's higher than Chicago, and then even after the Confederates retreat, you still got a population that's the size of places like Rochester, New York, and places like that. So,
wow.
It's been like on the order of 50, 60,000 Union troops left behind for a while.
And the problem for food stuff in the South too was not just. I mean, again, we think of the South as an agricultural area. People envision the Civil War, industrial North, agrarian South, right? But the South actually raised surprisingly didn't raise as much food as you might think. Of course, they would raise some corn and some peas, and wheat, but not nearly as much as the North. And because, of course, the South is investing a lot of land in cotton and to a lesser extent tobacco. And even when the war begins and you think, okay, now the South realizes that we're going to have to convert from cotton to corn in order to feed the armies during this war, you have a surprising number of people in the South who do not, who continue raising cotton and tobacco. They continue raising tobacco well through the war. I mean, even after the government has come out saying, be a patriot and don't grow tobacco.
Right.
The men in the army are going to pay for tobacco. Those soldiers got to have their tobacco.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you have that issue that a lot of Southern farmers are not making sort of altruistic decisions for the Southern government, and so they continue growing non-edible crops. But then we have this point in the book where we talk about when the war began, the South had roughly 57 million acres under cultivation, which should be plenty of land to provide enough food. But by the time the Union Army, by the time 1863, the summer of 1863 comes along, the Union Army, through its conquest of certain parts of the South, I mean, Kentucky has gone with the Union. Tennessee is largely taken over by the North. Much of Louisiana, much of Mississippi, much of the coast of North Carolina and Virginia. The South has lost 1/3 of their productive farmland. They've lost 18 million acres of that 15 million. And so now, by 1863, you're talking about the South is only operating on 2/3 as much farmland as they had before. And so,
all that farmland is not going towards the armies. It's not
exactly
like there's still selfish purposes. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And then throw into that something you mentioned at the very beginning of this broadcast, stem rust, right?
Yes.
So what happens when Mother Nature intervenes and provides a bit of a natural disaster, which is going to naturally reduce some food supply. And in 1862, unusually, because this was in the midst of what historians refer to as the Civil War drought from 1856 to 1865. In 1862, there was not a drought in the spring. It rained like hell. And that ends up flooding a lot of farmland along the Mississippi and the Yazoo and the Ouachita and the Tennessee River. And so they can't plant their crops as soon as they want to. It creates the conditions for stem rust amongst the wheat crop. The Shenandoah Valley loses, or the South as a whole loses 1/6 of its wheat crop. The Shenandoah Valley loses 50% alone in 1860. And so you have sort of like a double whammy. Like the South already isn't producing enough food because it's not making the right decisions. And then the weather is causing those crops that are being planted to be harvested in even shorter supply than they need to be. And so as a result, the Southern Army is tightening its belt almost from day one.
What is stem rust? We mentioned it, but we didn't explain it.
Yeah, it's a fungus that affects wheat, and it comes from rain at the wrong time, basically. And wheat, at least as I understand it, is sort of a marginal kind of crop in the South. It doesn't do well in real humid, wet, hot conditions. So it's confined to places like the northern reaches of North Carolina and the Shenandoah Valley and places like that. So when you get the least little thing that sort of tips the scale, like heavy rain in the spring, it causes this parasitic problem with the wheat. And that was part of it. Farming, I go back to my point, it's a dicey business anyway.
Well, yeah.
And doing it in the middle of the war is,
Yeah, right. Okay. So you mentioned before how the North had the better soil because of the glaciers and the South didn't. Go into the South soil a little bit more, and how did they combat the deficiencies in the soil through their farming?
Well, I'll start, and then Tim can sort of pick it up and run with it too.
Sure.
They had a couple different techniques. One they recognized was the constant need for new land. So farm a certain amount of land until it just isn't producing very much anymore, and then move on to new land. So for many farmers, that means constantly clearing new fields to open up unfarmed land. Land that had been woods can be utilized for a while. Letting certain fields lie fallow for a number of years to try to replenish some nutrients, maybe growing some other non-intensive crops on those fields so that they can sort of regenerate a little bit. And then the third thing is drown that joker in fertilizer. And the preferred fertilizer was guano, which is basically bat shit from off the islands, from islands off of South America. But it's hard, it's expensive, and it's once the war starts, almost impossible to import in the South. So you're not fertilizing fields really with guano once the war begins. And so those were the three ways that you sort of try to keep this already marginal soil in some form of fertility to produce some crops. And it was easier to maintain before the war because, again, South constantly expanding. This is one of the reasons why people are moving to Mississippi and Louisiana and into Texas to acquire new lands. But, once the war begins, then they have to sort of make do with the lands they have, and it just becomes a tougher proposition to do so.
I got a question before we go over to Tim. Were there no bats in the South?
Plenty of bats, but to get guano in any kind of concentration, you've got to have access to birds roosting somewhere, and so off these rocky islands off the coast of Central America and Peru are really the places where you get imported guano that's good for fertilizing soil. So,
but here's an argument that I would make: the North, if they had a problem and they needed guano, they would have figured out a way to get those bats and birds and whatever to roost in a certain area so they could collect the shit. I think like the South is just too stuck in their traditions. They couldn't innovate, and that was one of the reasons.
Well, you may be onto something there. And it really is kind of a theme that runs throughout this. The problem with southern soils is that they're acidic, and they get really acidic over time. They're formed not from glaciation, but mostly from erosion of the Appalachians and over time. And,
okay.
And there's not the same kind of sort of deposition of nutrients that you get in the north with the glaciation. And so those soils tend to go acidic really quickly. What the South does have is a long growing season that allows, these cash crops to be grown. But if you're going to grow those in an acidic soil, you either constantly, as Judkin says, you have to be rotating fields or moving to new ground. Even if you're rotating fields, you have to constantly be sort of expanding your agriculture so that there's a new field that you can clear. And that goes right back to one of the basic causes of the Civil War, at least as I understand it. Southerners are worried about, having enough territory to maintain the so-called Cotton Kingdom. And, it's a theme that runs through this. And Southern agriculture, while it produces these great cash crops, it's not all that efficient in terms of use of land. In a way, the North with the cattle, the grasses, and grain, the system they have is much more ecologically efficient.
So even though the South gets the reputation of being the agrarian society, the North even kind of did that better. But by virtue of their soil.
Yeah, that's a fact.
Yeah, it's one of the things. So there's certain myths about the war. So I teach Civil War every year, of course, and this is one of the things I do. Is myth number one is that the South is an agricultural paradise and the North is sort of all urban. It's like, well, actually, the North had more farms and better farms than the South did. It's just the South were raising the cash crops. Tobacco and cotton brought in a lot more dollars than wheat and corn did on northern.
So they were an agrarian economy in the South.
Sure.
But the North did it better.
And the North is largely an agrarian economy as well. 2 out of every 3 people in the North lived in a rural area.
Can we say that the country was an agrarian country at that time?
I think that's fair.
Okay.
I think that's fair.
That would be.
Yeah, but two different visions of agrarian.
Yes.
In the South, it's a lot of labor on a lot of land to make it work. In the North, it's more family farms, smaller farms that are ecologically better suited to that region.
And is it fair to say,
a place like Antietam or Gettysburg? I mean, that's a great example of sort of northern agriculture. Precisely what the North was fighting to preserve.
And going off of those two, Antietam and Gettysburg, or Sharpsburg and Gettysburg, is it fair to say that the northern agricultural mindset was more for sustenance, our own sustenance and the sustenance of others for $1, whereas in the South it was things that you don't necessarily need for eating, but you still kind of need, or at least in the case of tobacco, you think you need, and we can make a lot of money off of. So one was for profit, one was for sustenance, but profit from people wanting to sustain their lives. Is that fair and convoluted?
Well, I mean, it's convoluted, but I think.
Thank you.
So I think the fact of the matter is, both sides were profit oriented.
Of course.
The scale of the profits for the large farms in the South were higher. Of course, if you're a cotton farmer who's planting 1,000 acres of cotton, then you're going to make more money than some poorer farmer who only has a couple of acres he can devote to cotton.
Right.
Many Southern farms, especially the smaller farms or the people who were renting or tenants on land, I mean, they were largely growing subsistence agriculture as well. Whereas in the North, even smaller farms, they would grow plenty for them to eat, but then, of course, some to sell to market. And then the larger the farm in the North, the larger the market. I mean, the North provides Great Britain with 45% of its wheat during the Civil War. So, so we're shipping a lot of it overseas, even in the midst of our own war. I mean, the South isn't exporting any food because they have nothing to spare. So I think you have two farming societies, as Tim said, largely structured differently. But I mean, I think everybody's looking to if they can make a couple of bucks on something they're growing, then it makes life better in the future. And I think both sides had that in mind. And I just want to sort of quickly point back. You mentioned something about the South wasn't very innovative. I was like, actually, in some ways, you could say the South was quite innovative with the things they did to try to make do as replacements for the things they were missing. And one of the most famous ones, of course, is coffee.
Oh, yes. Good one.
Coffee is an imported crop in the United States. We're not growing coffee in the United States. But once the blockade comes, the South is importing no more coffee. And literally dozens of different ersatz coffee recipes in the South. The one that we use in the book is from Kate Stone, just outside of Vicksburg. And she says that after trying a whole bunch of different things, they all agree on is roasted okra seed is going to be their coffee. So, next time you're curious, roast some okra seed and see how that tastes as coffee.
I've been wondering that, and I don't think I'm going to try it.
I'm guessing not very good.
Yeah. Well, to be fair to myself, I was only really referring to them not being innovative when it comes to innovative when it comes to shit.
So excrement, right? Of course,
particularly bat shit. All right, so the war in Virginia, as we're talking about here, is ravaging the farms. So that's going to make it, because what the war zone in Virginia is really between Washington and Richmond. That's what, like 100 miles? What is that? 100 and not a lot of miles.
Yeah, it's probably 100.
Probably about 100 miles in between there, right? Sooner or later, with tens of thousands of men traipsing all over the place, living off the land, stealing whatever, that is going to be the wasteland that we're talking about. So that means that the Southern Army, at least, is going to have to search further into untouched lands in the South for their sustenance, but also the people living in that war zone, right? Early in the war, Lincoln had a policy: don't take from the locals. Go into that. What is that policy? What was the thinking behind it, and how long did it last?
So the policy is one that historians refer to as conciliation. This idea that the vast majority of Southerners were deep down loyal to the United States, and they had been duped or fooled or strong-armed into secession by a handful of more radical secessionists. And so Lincoln believed that if the federal government, if the Union armies showed kindness and benevolence to the Southerners, treated them with kid gloves, so to speak, then the Southerners would recognize the error of their ways and would give up this whole rebellion nonsense and rejoin the Union.
Hugs, not bombs.
By the summer of 1862, it becomes clear to Lincoln and most of leadership in the U.S. Army, not everyone, George McClellan remained a steadfast proponent of conciliation all the way through. But by the summer of 62, when McClellan fails to take Richmond, Lincoln realizes that, I was wrong. The vast majority of Southerners are not loyal at heart. They really have drunk the Kool-Aid. I mean, they really are in on this secession game. And so then you have the federal government starts passing certain laws, starting with the Confiscation Acts, specifically the Second Confiscation Act in August of 1862, that basically says, okay, you can take the kid gloves off. Now you can confiscate the property of those who are disloyal to the Union, whether it's their wagon, their food, their slaves, whatever. And so that really sort of starts this, what Mark Grimsley, the historian, called the hard hand of war. He wrote a book by that title and sort of describes it in some detail. And so, so you have sort of the first year of the war was a year of more sort of benevolent, velvet-gloved treatment by armies of the South. But by the summer of 1962, that's over.
And summer of 1962, we talked before about Jackson and his boys at the trains eating their fill, and right after that, Lee decides that he's going to march up into the north and try to get some grub, among other things. But
right.
but food is a huge factor in that, and much to their chagrin, as they're going up, a lot of the crops that they're coming up to are still green. The corn and the apples and whatnot. And I hate to sound like I'm dwelling on this stuff, but I think it's such an important piece of life at that time, especially in the Army, that we don't think about today. And it makes it sound so absolutely disgusting and miserable. And that is what that does to the body. These Confederates are near starvation, and their bodies, I'm imagining, if you're near starvation and you're marching, and I've driven a lot of these roads that these guys walked on, and just driving them, the rolling hills, the constant up and down, I get tired for my car driving it. And these guys are walking on low caloric intake. They're virtually starving. And then they put some food into their system, any food, because like you're talking about before, when you're thirsty, you're going to drink whatever. Same thing when you're hungry, you're going to eat whatever. And if all you got is green corn and apples, what is that going to do to your system? And what is that going to do to the roads you're walking on and the battlefield itself and all that other stuff?
Well, what you really need if you're in that state of near starvation is protein, and instead you get these sort of high sugar kind of carbohydrates in green corn and green apples, and it causes a very swift evacuation of the bowels, to put it delicately, and causes moisture to be retained in the intestines, and gives you diarrhea, or as some of the soldiers called it, the Virginia Quick Step, and so when Lee's men are going, when they're crossing the river into Maryland, I mean, there are just all these god awful reports that everybody's underwear is tattered and hanging and dripped.
Yes.
And these guys are bent over in the fields, retching and defecating. And there's a great quote from somebody that said, "I've never seen so many filthy men. 3 in a room would make it unbearable." So it's and Judkin had a great line there that it's actually his in the book about this isn't it lacked romance.
The image.
Totally.
The image of all these soldiers bending over to vomit or squatting to defecate on the way to Sharpsburg lacks romance, but was reality.
Absolutely. Here, so you're talking about that quote, 3 in a room. The quote is 3 in a room, bleeding and ulcerated rectums, as well as gullets sore from retching, symptoms that left the Southern soldiers weakened and irritable. I would imagine so. The image of thousands of threadbare Confederate soldiers reeking of excrement, bile, and body odor, squatting to defecate or bending over to vomit in the fields and woods lining the roads to Maryland, lacked romance, but such were the hard realities of sustaining the Southern Army. I think there's something, I don't know if I read it in here. No, I think I did read it in here. Here. This is another one to give you an idea here. I believe this is after the battle. One visitor who arrived at Antietam, several days after the battle, noted that he could still track the movements of, no pun intended either, I'm sure, the movements of Lee's men, quote, by the thickly strewn belt of green corn husks and cobs and the, quote, ribbon of dysenteric stools just behind. That sounds so disgusting, but it's a fact of life. Horses do it, and so do people. And
they were fertilizing the fields.
For me, it's just so hard to imagine because, and not to get too gross here, but I have a day where I have diarrhea or something like that. I can't do anything. Like these guys are marching, they're fighting. I guess, like, what's the physical effect? And I don't know. I know neither one of you are medical doctors, so maybe this is the wrong question to ask, and I'll cut it out if you don't have an answer for it. But, what is the physical effect that these men might have endured just from the starvation alone? Actually, scratch this part. I don't know what I'm asking. I'm searching for what I'm actually getting at, but I can't get there. So I just marked it. I'm going to cut it out. Okay, go ahead.
One of the things that we talk about in a sort of earlier in the chapter, in an earlier chapter, is that if the Union and Confederate soldiers were able to get their daily allotted ration, the U.S. Army 1860 guide for daily rations that the Confederacy, of course, copied because they were all U.S. Army guys before. Mm-hmm. Ate only your daily ration, you would get between 3,500 and 4,000 calories a day, which would be plenty for most days. But the problem, of course, with even for the Union Army was that when you're on the march, the rations are on the supply wagons in the back. And if the weather's bad, the wagons are going to get stuck in the mud. So you're going to go a few days without adequate rations. And if you're the Confederacy, those wagons in the back probably never had adequate rations to begin with. And so you have guys who are, marching several miles in the heat and the dust and the rain and the mud, burning 4,000, 5,000 calories a day. And sometimes they're lucky if they get, 500 calories. You have certain Confederate soldiers saying we were only fed 4 ears of corn or 8 ears of corn for the whole day. And, that's only a few hundred calories. And so you have, sustained weakness that comes from this, of course, and then you're more susceptible to illness. You're more susceptible to disease because your body's immune system is weakened as a result. And so it's one of the reasons to sort of understand why soldiers in both armies, but particularly in the Confederate Army, were sick so often because of nutrition. Basically, they're not drinking healthy water and they're not getting adequate nutrition. Not even proteins versus grains versus veggies, but just any kind of calorie.
Yeah. So the armies are going through all of these problems. The people back home are going through all these problems with food shortages and things like that, to the point where some of the ladies decide that they're going to riot. Talk about the food riots and all the effects that those had.
Well, I think what happens in the spring of 1863 is the manifestation of all of those farm we just talked about in 1862. The rains that had ruined much of the wheat crop, and then of course the drought came back in the summer of 62 and burned up a lot of the corn crop. And as a result, when the spring of 63 comes along, there is not only enough food for the armies, there's not enough food for people living in urban areas on the southern home front. And so you have a lot of Southern women who basically the men are off at the army and, who's going to provide for them? There had been basic promises made by local leaders or governmental leaders that, we'll provide for you when your husband has gone off to the army. And that's just not happening because there's not enough food to go around, or the food that's available is too expensive and they can't afford it. So beginning in mid-March 1863, starting in Atlanta, but then spreading throughout dozens of cities in the South, most famously in early April in Richmond, you have a number of Southern women who basically storm into stores wielding weapons and confiscate bread or bacon or salt in some places. And these riots stretch from Richmond, Virginia, to Atlanta, Georgia, Salisbury, North Carolina, Mobile, Alabama, and everywhere in between. And it's what it really leads to, as some of your listeners may have read Stephanie McCurry's Confederate Reckoning, or even if they haven't read it, it's plug for it. What it leads to, as Stephanie McCurry has argued, is the creation really of the first true welfare system in the United States. And it was it's the Confederate governments that created a sort of poor relief, a welfare system for the women in response to these riots, because they're like, boy, one thing we cannot have happen is we can't have these riots continue if we want men to stay in the armies.
But you have the problem, though. You make the point in the book. I'll read it right here. Even such government largesse could not alleviate the triple environmental threat of bad weather, lost labor, and diminishing land. They're losing their land. They've already lost their workforce because they're impressed into the service. And what was the other thing? Bad weather. The weather hasn't been agreeing with them either. So it was hard for them to keep up with that system, right?
Right. And then the government compounds the issue by passing some legislation to try to increase the foodstuffs, but it actually ends up backfiring, especially when they pass the impressment law in 1863, which allows government agents to legally, because they've been doing it for a while anyway, but to legally impress food from Southern farms in order to feed the armies and to feed the urban areas. And they think it's going to lead to more food, but actually what it does is it leads to farmers to not grow food, because they're like, you're not going to pay me enough money. It's not going to be worth it. So why bother? If all I'm going to do is grow stuff to be taken, then I'm just not going to grow stuff.
See, so you're saying a government imposed tax doesn't actually create more of what they're trying to create. Like, for example, this is so crazy. I can't believe this doesn't work. Based on the church tithe system, actually, you say, the new measure allowed farmers to reserve 50 bushels of sweet potatoes, 100 bushels of corn, or 50 bushels of wheat, and 20 bushels of peas or beans for their own use, but it demanded 10% of all remaining produce above those minimums. So they were allowed to keep some for themselves. Right? Go ahead.
Right. Well, so that's the tax in kind law that you described, which was the second.
Oh, this was different. Okay.
And I mean, it wasn't any more beloved, trust me, but the impressment law was much more maligned, because the impressment law basically said agents could come in, take whatever your food they wanted. They would pay you for it, but they would pay you in, IOUs for Confederate money, which was inflating day. So, the value was practically worthless.
So they added this tax in kind law to the Impressment Act. So I can come along as an agent and take this food and give you worthless IOUs, and then on top of that, what? You as the farmer get to keep this much of these things and then give 10% on top of what I've already taken to the government?
Correct.
Boy, oh boy. It's amazing they lasted 4 years.
Well, when we were doing the book, and I'm sort of a rookie. Well, not sort of. I was a rookie Civil War historian. I kept asking Judkin, how in the world did the South ever think they could win?
Yeah.
What's the story here? I mean, what was going on? I mean, there's just overwhelming odds, and screw ups along the way. I just, just was very difficult for me to wrap my head around that.
Yeah, I never realized until reading this just how effed up they were. Like, really, Judkin, what were they thinking?
Well, first and foremost, they thought they weren't going to do it alone. The biggest thing is that when the war began, the South was convinced that European countries were going to come in on their side,
all right,
specifically Great Britain.
Time out. Did they talk to Great Britain before starting the war? Like, did they say, hey,
they
Great Britain?
Ambassadors.
Yeah. But did Great Britain say, well, go ahead, see what you could do, we'll back you?
No, there was no promise given.
What a shock. Okay. The
South was convinced that Britain was so dependent on their cotton, because Britain at the time when the war broke out was importing 80% of its cotton from the American South. Mm-hmm. And the largest factories in Britain were textile factories. And so that was employing the greatest number of people. And so the South was convinced that Britain would face labor riots and chaos on the home front if they didn't get that cotton. So therefore, the South they were sure that Britain would join us. And it wasn't really until late 1862 when it starts to become clear to many in the South that Britain actually maybe isn't going to join us.
And why is that?
That Britain had basically found alternative means of cotton production, at least enough to get them through the war. Mm-hmm. Britain had a lot going on in Europe. They're trying to maintain the balance of power in Europe. They're afraid of what them joining the American war might do to the balance of power in Europe. And so Britain, they have their eyes on other things. They are not eager to get involved in the American war. And so some would argue they get kind of close in the fall of 62 of offering a mediation of the war, but then Antietam happens and Britain decides, no, maybe the South isn't as close to winning as we thought they were. But in the eyes of Southerners, by late 1862, when it kind of becomes apparent to knowledgeable men that Britain probably isn't going to join the war is actually going fairly well in the eyes of many Southerners by 1862. I mean, Lee has taken over. We've driven the Union Army back from Richmond. We've invaded the North. And so the South thinks, we're going to win this thing. And Fredericksburg happens, which is a great Confederate victory. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Chancellorsville happens, which is another Confederate victory. And so going into the summer of 63, even though the South is limping along in many ways, militarily, it looks like, we're going to win this thing.
And I know I'm speaking with hindsight, but to me, it's if you're doing well on the battlefield, but if you can't feed your own people, if you can't prosecute this war without your population starving, I mean, how far do you think you could take it just by winning on battlefields? So are they thinking that we keep winning on this battlefield, one more victory and this is over and we can go back to normal? Is that kind of the sense, like kind of the way people were this year with, 2021 will come and everything will be okay again. Like this weird arbitrary thing is going to suddenly make everything okay. Is that kind of what's going on?
I think certainly that's true. And a lot of it has to do with Lee. After Lee's success in the summer of 62 and the fall of 62, a lot of Southerners basically equate the Confederacy with Lee's army. And as long as Robert E. Lee's in the field, he's going to pull some rabbit out of his hat and we're going to win this thing. And even Lee himself still very much believed in this sort of Napoleonic mindset of one decisive battle. I'm going to win Austerlitz, which is this decisive Napoleonic battle. And I'm going to win the battle that either annihilates the Union Army or comes close to it, that they're going to sue for peace. And, got caught up in that mindset, thinking that, Lee will win the big one somehow.
And from an environmental standpoint, if I could just throw this in,
sure.
you can sort of chart Southern fortunes by the food supply. I mean, it's adequate at first, and it's long. They hang in there and actually win victories until late 1862, when the food is beginning to run out, and so are the horses and other things that they need. So it's almost, I mean, you can really sort of parallel the two from an environmental standpoint. Southern fortunes rise and fall with the sort of environmental demands of the war.
It is interesting because it does make you look at everything in a different light now when you consider all these environmental factors. They're very real things that these guys had to endure and deal with, and that I'm sure colors a lot of their decisions. So it makes a lot of sense. The whole thing, though, with the Confederacy and Britain especially, reminds me of like when I was, 13 or 14, middle school, when you start, getting crushes on girls and trying to get a girlfriend and all that stuff. And you make up these fantasies in your head that like, well, if I do this, then she'll see that I love her. And then she'll come to me and blah, 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 blah. And then you go and do it and you're completely disappointed because she's completely oblivious and she likes another boy. Like, it's a great lesson to study the Confederacy. It's a great lesson in the old adage, what is it now about assuming? You should never assume because it makes an ass out of you and me. Like, you're gonna get into a war. You're gonna try to secede. Make sure that you think the people who are gonna back your hand might be on board with you first before you just go around assuming things. It is kind of it's sad because it was such a waste of life. And it really, when you look at it now, it's just, they never really had a chance. And it's just a terrible waste. But I don't know. I get sentimental that way. But okay. So, what else do you want to add? You want to add anything? You want to add anything else before we close here? How about,
I think
go ahead.
I think we've done a pretty good job. Maybe one other point I would say is Tim and I kind of like bringing up the people love going to battlefields today.
Yeah.
And when you go to certain battlefields and you think that, well, this battlefield has been preserved, it looks just like it did at the time of the war, except for, certain modernities like, paved roads and electric wires and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that most of the Civil War battlefields that the National Park Service does so good a job preserving today, really just sort of coincidentally look like the battlefields that the soldiers would have encountered. And Tim has a little bit, I'm going to set him up, that he talks about sort of Antietam, which in my opinion is perhaps one of the most bucolic and well-preserved of the battlefields because it's far enough away from Washington, D.C. not to be a bedroom community.
Right.
But so I'll let Tim say a few words about Antietam, and then I'll say a couple of words about the wilderness, and I think we'll have it off our system.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Antietam, as Judkin was saying, a battlefield is like everything else in nature. It's a living thing. It constantly changes, and it's very difficult to kind of freeze that as it was in September of 1862. It requires constant vigilance by the National Park Service and the other people involved in running it. And even now, the Antietam battlefield is significantly smaller than the original battlefield, but they have to constantly be pruning trees, cutting back things, getting rid of invasive species, fertilizing David Miller's cornfield, whatever to make this look like it did in 1862. And my favorite example from that is that Antietam is now sort of almost like a lot of places overrun with exploding white-tailed deer populations, and what those starving Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers wouldn't have given, if they could have had access to a huge deer population like that at the time. But these things are constantly shifting, and while you can still go there and you can still see Burnside's bridge reconstructed, you can still see Antietam Creek and the Sunken Road, et cetera. It's more of a kind of a sanitized version, I think, of a Civil War battlefield, because you can't smell the powder, you can't know the pain of a bullet wound or the sort of fear of going into battle. You certainly don't smell the decaying corpses of men and animals, or know what it's like to be starving. And all you want to do is just eat a decent meal. Mm-hmm. So I think what we have is kind of a sanitized version of the war. It's the war as we like to remember it, not as it was.
Yeah. Right, and that's a great point.
The terrain is basically the undulations of the land are more or less similar, but that's about all you can really get. And Gettysburg has this great story too, right? That Ted Turner of his kiss with fame in the movie Gettysburg, donates $50,000 to the park in order to bury the power lines along Emmitsburg Road, so that the people who want to walk Pickett's Charge to the angle don't have to see them anymore. Mm-hmm. But the battlefield that I mentioned, or that we mentioned in the book, sort of in closing, is the Battle of the Wilderness, because when people go there today, you think, okay, this is a densely wooded area and it looks like it did when the soldiers arrived. But, to the National Park Service credit, they do a great job of keeping the tree line where it was, but the trees themselves do not look like they did at the time of the battle. At the time of the battle, wilderness, it had been a cutover area. There'd been an iron furnace nearby that was fueled, that the trees had fueled, and so that iron furnace went out of business in 1847. By the time of the battle, the trees had only been growing for 17 years, which meant most of them were no thicker than 3 or 4 inches and no taller than 20 feet. It was rare to have a tree that was thicker or taller than that. And when you go to the wilderness battlefield today, which Tim and I did with my daughter a couple of years ago when we were writing the book, and you got 3 foot thick trees that are 100 feet tall, and what the soldiers wouldn't have given to have something like that to hide behind, but instead all they encountered were low canopy saplings, and there was literally nowhere to hide from incoming bullets, no cover whatsoever. It makes it much more terrifying, actually, when you think of that.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, people who like to visit battlefields, and I like it as much as the next person, just recognize that not all is as it seems.
Right. No, that's a good point. We try to point that out too. With here, you have the woods, like McPherson's Woods, for example.
Yeah, it's frozen on my screen.
Oh, can you hear me still? Can you not hear me? What happened? Hello.
Well, I assume it's been long enough he can edit this part out.
Yeah,
maybe the meeting time ran out or something, isn't he?
No, you're still there.
Eric, can you hear us? He's still frozen on my screen.
Yeah, I can
hear you. You can't hear us? Hello. Why is it?
Let me see it real quick. I'll get out and then get back in.
Okay. Well, they might leave when they see you go out.
Frozen in a couple of...
I'm going to do it quick. If I can get this to... What the hell is happening?
I hear them, but I don't... Oh, I hate technology.
So real time over here. Now.
Can you hear us at least? Oh, now you're all breaking up.
Why is this not sending now?
Here, let me see if...
Jump in on yours. I sent
you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Where is it here?
The signal got weakened somewhere.
Yeah. Hold on. Let me see here. Can you let me in there now?
Yeah, you're in.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Well.
Okay. All right. Hold on. We're gonna switch. It's just something with his phone.
The previous, about the time I started in the wilderness, you froze, and I think we lost you for that whole section.
Oh, okay. Well, I heard you. We heard you clearly for that part.
Okay.
So what I said to that was what? Here at Gettysburg, we have the same issue with like McPherson's Woods, for example. We always try to stress to people that, at the time you could see from one end of the woods to the other because there was no underbrush. Because the farmers used it for their animals to graze in and get out of the sun. So there are a lot of differences, and the park roads themselves make a big difference. And but yeah, you're right. It's idyllic. It's the way we want to remember it. But they might have been beautiful, bucolic areas when the armies arrived, but it wasn't very long before they were devastated, disgusting. Just
not a place you wanted to be on July 4th.
No, none of them were. Guys, thank you very much for doing this. Thank you for writing this book. It's such a cool book. I really enjoy it. What is it? University of North Carolina Press, right?
Right.
And the authors are Judkin Browning and Timothy Silver. The book is An Environmental History of the Civil War. It's available at addressinggettysburg.com/books. We have it linked there. Go ahead, get yourself a copy. You will not be disappointed. The only thing you'll want is more. So we have to get them to write a second one, a follow-up that covers more of this stuff, because this is really a fascinating book. Guys, thank you very much for coming on, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, guys, that was
Awesome.
good. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
A lot of
Hopefully
fun.
you can edit something out of that. I don't know how the kerfuffle went when we lost you there for a couple minutes.
Yeah, I'll just cut that part out, but it's a clean cut because I started after you were finished with the wilderness. I started talking, and then you said where to go. I can't hear him.
Yeah, that was when you were frozen on our screen. So
So I know what I was starting to say, so I can just get to where I actually say it, and you guys are back, and yeah, it'll be fine.
cool.
It'll be fine.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Well, hey,
guys. I don't know what happened on my end.
Oh, it's no problem. Do you mind
No worries.
send us a link to the podcast, and I'll forward it on to family and friends.
Will do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank
Cool.
you very